Hello there, squirrels. It's Halloween Eve at 11:37. We don't have much more to read, but I might get started on something else. We'll see. Okay, so David, the dad, had taken off. He's going to the bar or somewhere. And the wife, what's her name, Allison, didn't want him to go by that one way because she said it was a cliff or whatever. He fussed at her about that. Said, I'm not going a mile out of the way, blah, blah, blah. So here we get the last thing I read was, and David gave his horse a touch with the whip, and away he trotted. Allison stood till the sound of hooves had died away, and then went back into the house with a boding heart. Sandy returned from school at noon in high spirits and asked his mother's leave to bring home a schoolfellow to play with him in the afternoon. It was wonderful how his spirits had rallied since his vision of a few days before. It seemed as though his body had now grown strong enough to shake off the ghastly influence entirely, but his mother was shattered both by memory and apprehension. A dreadful restlessness possessed her as night drew on, and after the shouts of the boys at play were over, and silence fell on house and garden, she slipped out unnoticed, and walked in the twilight to the beach. It was high midsummer, when in those latitudes the sunset lingers on the western horizon, till in the east the vigorous dawn breaks to quench its lesser light. The crescent moon hung low in the sky over the gently murmuring sea that glimmered mysteriously in the diffused twilight, and the brown rocks loomed dark above the water, a time and a place to suggest eerie feelings to the most unimpressionable. But Allison's whole mind was so filled with the apprehensions of approaching doom that the scene had no effect on her. She scarcely noticed where she was. The fear that possessed her was inward, and neither suggested nor could it be increased by the aspect of familiar things. She did not meet a soul in her restless wanderings. As she opened the house door on her return, the clock struck 12. Oh, when would David be home? He was seldom later than midnight. Allison needed no light, and creeping softly upstairs, she entered Sandy's room, and drawing aside the curtain by the solemn twilight of the northern night, she saw his sleeping face, calm and peaceful as an infant's. Did she grudge him his untroubled sleep, that she would rather have found him awake and oppressed with terror as herself? While she stood listening to the beating of her own heart, that sounded louder than the breathing of her child, she heard the first distant sound of approaching hooves, and as they rapidly drew nearer, she recognized Kelpie's familiar steps. Thank God, he's safe home, she said. And lest her husband should be displeased to find her sitting up for him, she hastened to her room and lighted a candle. The horse had stopped opposite the house, and David had had time to dismount, but he had not opened the gate. Someone might be detaining him there, yet there was no sound of voices to be heard, only Kelpie impatiently striking the ground with one of his forefeet. Allison looked out of the window, but could see nothing for the high wall, and as several minutes passed and still her husband did not come, and the horse stamped with increasing impatience, she slipped downstairs out of doors and across the garden to the gate. So deadly a fear lay upon her spirit that when she flung the gate open and saw Kelpie standing riderless on the dusky highway, she felt no surprise, only an assurance that Sandy's vision was about to come true. "Oh, Kelpie, lad, your master's no far to seek," she said as she led the trembling, sweating beast towards the stable yard. Then, without calling up any of the men, just as she was, with uncovered head, Allison Galbraith sped through the dusk and the silence of the summer night. "The steep brae by Sir Ewan Campbell's gates, the steep brae by Sir Ewan Campbell's gates," she said to herself as she ran. And when the dark firs trees and high wall bounding the park came in sight, her limbs almost gave way beneath her. Then she reached the great iron gates between granite pillars, and in the twilight she caught sight through their bars of the black avenue within, and heard the wind sigh in the boughs. Allison pressed her hands to her heart and urged herself on. Now a bat cut its zigzag flight through the air and startled her. The white scud of a frightened rabbit shone out in the dusk as it flashed across her path in search of a friendly burrow, and her echoing steps woke many a sleeping bird and set it fluttering with fear. The next turn in the road would bring her to the foot of the hill, and to something that she dared not name that she knew was waiting for her there. She closed her eyes for an instant as she rounded the curve of the road and clenched her hands. Then the soft silence of the summer night was broken by a wailing cry, and Allison Galbraith fell senseless on the dead body of her husband. David was sober that night, but as he rode through the murk lanes the old horror had overtaken him. He thought he had heard a horseman following hard upon him, and clapped spurs to his beast and galloped down the hill, at the foot of which Kelpie slipped on a rolling stone, threw his rider heavily to the ground, and he neither spoke nor moved again. Allison Galbraith did not long survive her husband, and her death took place without Sandy having any intimation of its approach. He never had vision or prophetic foresight again after his father died. The weird gift departed from him with his weakly childhood, and he grew up robust and stout, thriving and commonplace as his forebears. Sandy is even a better farmer than his father before him, and is in a fair way to solve the problem of how to make 2 blades of wheat grow where only one had grown before. He has married a wife, practical and matter-of-fact as himself, and their sons and daughters are as guiltless of imagination as they are of any touch of the uncanny. The burly lowland farmer can never be induced to speak of the second sight, even to his most intimate friends. In the early days of their married life, his young wife ventured to ask him about the visions of his childhood, of which she had heard, but he silenced her with such severity that she did not again dare to approach. More stories by Louisa Baldwin, the subject, and she will never know whether the stories of her husband's uncanny childhood are wild legends or plain truth. And that is all. And I found, let's see, what was that other story I found? For we only have time since tomorrow is Halloween. Because in November, I think I would like to read, some family Thanksgiving-y kind of Walton kind of something, maybe. Okay, this is it. The Shadow on the Blind. I've just read the first part of it. Okay, it says about the story, and it's by the same author, Louisa Baldwin. The Shadow on the Blind is the title story from Louisa Baldwin's 1895 anthology, The Shadow on the Blind and Other Ghost Stories. It's the story of a couple that rents a haunted house. As is often the case in tales of this nature, the husband does not believe in ghosts and ridicules the house's reputation as a hot spot for supernatural activity. Not surprisingly, by the end of the story, he's been forced to reevaluate his opinion about ghosts. Alright, here we go. The Shadow on the Blind. Harbleton Hall had stood empty for 7 years. For 7 years, no smoke had issued from its chimneys, telling of the cheerful hearth within. No voice or laughter had been heard under its roof, no footstep coming or going across its threshold. A straggling growth of ivy and Virginia creeper that covered the walls and veiled the windows made the front of the house look as forlorn and neglected as the face of a sick man who has grown a ragged beard during a long illness. The window sills were green with the drip of rain from the spouts choked with decaying leaves, and the brickwork was stained with dark patches of damp. The birds had built their nest undisturbed in every gable and projection of the roof, and in the wide chimneys secure from danger of being smoked out of their comfortable quarters. And within the house, though man had withdrawn his presence from it, other tenants were in possession. Rats and mice held revels in the empty rooms and passages that resounded with the patter of their feet, the squeak of their voices, and the nibbling of their teeth. In the dead of night, bold as they had grown, they scared themselves by catching in wires that set bells ringing and echoing through the house, and an army of rats would rush helter-skelter down the great staircase, bounding over one another's backs in their panic, as we see them depicted in illustrations of the famous history of Whittington and his cat. If desolation reigned in Harbleton Hall, its gardens were returning to a state of savage nature, and the rank growth of weeds choked and overtopped the flowers and shrubs. No seeds had been sown, no lawns mown, no hedges clipped or tree or bush pruned in 7 long years. Time to pour some tea. Don't you love my cool hat Steve made? It's rainy, rainy and chilly here in central North Carolina. I like calling North Carolina home. It used to be a song on a commercial. Where was I? And the once orderly gardens had become a tangled thicket where the fairy prince might seek the sleeping beauty. A bramble had sprung up by the sundial, and clasping it in its thorny arms threw its branches about it, effectually hiding it from the light of day. The stone basin of the diffused fountain had become a nursery of young frogs that hopped, swam, and croaked undisturbed, and nature was endeavoring to reestablish her sway where man had withdrawn his I think I read that, or did I? Cultivating and restraining hand. It was a radiant day in June. The hot sun poured down on the tangled overgrowth in the gardens of Harbleton Hall. The birds were in a perfect riot of song, and a southwest wind rocked them on the bough. Even the old even the old forsaken house on such a day wore its least somber aspect. One could imagine there had been happy household life within its walls, and it was possible to conceive that they might again resound to the laughter and voices of children at play. Some such thought as this must have entered the mind of an elderly gentleman driving by in an open carriage with his wife, a pale gray-haired lady seated next to him. Mr. Stackpoole was a cheerful, energetic man of 60 years of age, of strong likes and dislikes and sudden impulses. As he caught sight of the wide front of Harbleton Hall with its red gables glowing in the sun, its confused mass of creepers almost hiding the lower stories from view, He told the coachman to draw up at the iron gates at the entrance. "This is a very picturesque house, my dear. I should like to have a look at it," he said to his wife. "It may be the kind of place we're in search of." And he alighted from the carriage as nimbly as a young man to read the notice painted on the weather-stained board fastened to the gates. "For admission to view these premises, apply to Mr. Judd, sexton by the church." Mr. Stackpole returned to the carriage and bade the coachman drive to the church, the tower of which they could see, embowered among trees apparently not more than a quarter of a mile distant. As they drove, he continued, "I like the look of the place very much. I'm sure I could do something with it. I should just enjoy setting to work upon it to call order out of chaos. And in 6 months I would undertake to effect an entire transformation in the house and grounds, and make it one of the prettiest places in the neighborhood. What do you think, my dear? Hey?" The frail-looking elderly lady thus addressed made but a faint rejoinder, and her husband's sanguine enthusiasm by no means communicated itself to her. Harbleton Hall was the 6th old house to which Mr. Stackpole had taken a fancy in the last 10 years, and fallen out of love with as quickly after exercising his ingenuity and putting it in perfect order, and living in it for a short time. It was his diversion, now that he had retired from business and had nothing particular to do, to hunt up old country houses, put them in thorough modern repair and working order, live in them just long enough to induce his wife to hope that he had pitched his tent finally, when the demon of unrest would break out in him once more, and he was off again on the old quest. This hunting of houses, catching them and then letting them go, that he might pursue game of the same kind elsewhere, was naturally more entertaining to Mr. Stackpole than it could be to his wife and daughter. But the elderly lady was patient and philosophic, and when her daughter said petulantly, "Oh, Mama, what a shame it is that we have to be dragged about the country like this. We've not been a year in this lovely house, and Papa is tired of it already, and looking out again for some tumble-down old place to put that in good order and leave it too, I suppose." Mrs. Stackpole would say, "Never mind, Ella, Papa must do as he thinks best. The excitement and interest he finds in frequently changing house are necessary to him, now that he is done with business. And remember, my dear, he has no home occupations to pass the time like you and I have." But Ella Stackpole, I thought, was now married and settled in a home of her own, and the only other child, a son, was stationed with his regiment in Malta. Therefore it was that when Mr. Stackpole became suddenly interested in the appearance of Harbleton Hall, his wife was unable to feel any enthusiasm on the subject. Their last home had been in Cornwall, where, after 6 months spent in its most westerly corner, Mr. Stackpole discovered what everyone else had always known, that he was in a decidedly rainy part of England. He could scarcely have been more astonished at the quantity of rain that fell if it had been in Egypt. And he fled to London to make that his headquarters, while he looked about for an old house to suit his fancy in the drier county of Surrey. And on this bright June day, he and his wife were driving through the fair country house hunting, and the more dilapidated a house looked, provided that his experienced eye saw capacities of improvement about it, the more attractive it appeared to Mr. Stackpole, as affording wider scope for his particular form of genius. His was a costly hobby, and strangers reaped the benefit of his lavish outlay on houses he perfected, tired of, and left so soon. Mr. Judd, the sexton, was found without difficulty, for indeed he was a conspicuous object, sitting in a large armchair by his cottage door, reading the newspaper and taking an occasional sip from a glass of cold brandy and water that stood beside him on the window-sill. He was a person of dignity in the village, accustomed to waste his own time and that of others. But Mr. Stackpole hurried him off to the carriage as soon as he had found the keys, and compelled him to unwonted activity. "The garden be a wilderness, sir," said the old man, opening one of the great iron gates, "and it's 4 years since e'er an inquiry was made about the place." "It wouldn't be to everyone's taste, you see. It'll need a considerable outlay upon it before it's fit for habitation," said Mr. Stackpole complacently, as he stooped to disentangle a briar from his wife's skirt. "Who were the last tenants, and how long had they lived here?" he said, turning to the old man and asking 2 questions at once. "Sir Elland Shaw and his family had at last, sir. They took the place on a 21 years lease, and they left uncommon sudden when it had 5 years and more to run. There was a deal of talk about what made 'em leave it that way." And Judd opened wide the front door as he spoke, and they entered a large, lofty hall, smelling mouldy as though there were vaults below. "Folks did say there were reasons more than what they'd own up to for a large family to turn out all of a sudden, as if they was running away from the plague." And the old sexton looked mysterious, and as though he longed to be questioned. Mr. Stackpole, however, was too much interested in pacing the length of the dining room to notice any hints he might throw out. "My dear," he said to his wife, who was resting on the low window seat, "we'll take the whole of this oak floor. We will have the whole of this oak floor polished, and Turkish rugs laid down at intervals." "That's just what we did in our house in Cumberland," said Mrs. Stackpole gently, "and if you remember, you were not pleased with it when it was done." "Midnight! It's Halloween! Happy Halloween!" "And you were not pleased with it when it was done," "You were going to tell us why Sir Elland Shaw left so suddenly." "Forbid, ma'am, that I should say definite why he left, not knowing for certain," said Mr. Judd, swelling with importance as he spoke. "I never believe more than half of what I hear, and puts no faith in tales, whether master's or man's, but by what I can make out, and old Jimmy Judd can see through a stone wall as fur as most folks, I should say, his ghost was at the bottom of the whole kick-up." Mrs. Stackpole smiled at the old man's mode of expressing himself, and then looked anxiously towards her husband, who laughed heartily, and they left the dining room for the upstairs regions, which he was impatient to explore. "They fled before ghosts, did they?" said Mr. Stackpole, still laughing at the idea. "If the house is supposed to be haunted, I should like it all the better for its reputation." And he swung open the door of a large low room with a deep projecting chimney place and wide window, letting in a flood of sunshine. "This is certainly a very cheerful aspect," said his wife, stepping to the window and looking out upon the wild garden enclosed by ragged yew hedges. "There's nothing ghostly about this room, at all events." "Pooh, ghost indeed! Those who believe in them deserve to see them," said Mr. Stackpole contemptuously. "If we take the house, this shall be your morning room. You'll get plenty of sunshine, which is a great thing for you, and if I like the room under it, I will have it done up for a business room for myself." And they wandered from cellar to attic of the big house, Mr. Stackpole delighted with the possibilities of the place, and noting in his pocket book the dimensions of the chief rooms and of the entrance hall. "At all events, I shall inquire on what terms the house is to be let," he said, after spending 2 hours in energetically inspecting the premises, and as he slipped 5 shillings into Mr. Judd's expectant palm. "By the way, I have not asked, who is the landlord?" "The landlord, sir, be many and not one," said the old man, named a well-known city company to which the property belonged. "I've rented from landlords and landladies and trustees, but never yet from a company. But it's all one to me, and I shall see their agent in town tomorrow." Then Mr. Stackpole took a farewell look at the room on the ground floor, immediately under the cheerful room at the head of the stairs, that he had assigned to his wife's prospective use, and decided that it was exactly adapted to his requirements. After which they threaded their way back to the gates through the neglected maze of the garden. "And how do you like the look of Harbleton Hall?" he asked his wife as they drove away. "What do you think of the old place?" "I confess that I was not very favorably impressed with it, though it is a handsome, well-built house, and might be made very comfortable, no doubt, but it struck me with a kind of chill." "So would any place, my dear, that had been shut up for 7 years. I feel it in my back now. I wish it may not mean an attack of lumbago for me." Mrs. Stackpole smiled at the literal interpretation of her words. "I don't mean that kind of chill, but a sort of depressed, foreboding feeling that I've never had before in any of the houses you and I have been over together, and their name is Legion." I guess meaning many. "Why, Anna, you don't mean to say that the tedious old sexton has frightened you with his gossip?" "It was merely some nonsense or other he made up to increase its importance. If I take the place, I shall put an army of workmen in an army of workmen in an army of work." I think that was messed up. "In a week from now, and when next you see it, with good fires drying the rooms, windows bright and clean, and papers and painters busy upon it, it will look very different, I can assure you. Any house that has been uninhabited as long as Harbleton Hall wears a forlorn look, but for all that I see the possibilities of it, and I could make it the prettiest place we have lived in yet." And Mrs. Stackpole felt certain that her husband would take the old house. The following day, when Mr. Stackpole saw the company's agent, he was surprised at the very moderate rent asked for the house. Whether he wished to take it on lease or as a yearly tenant, the sum demanded was small enough to arouse suspicion in the most unwary. "Why do you ask such a low rent for such a fine old place like that?" he asked. "It's so much out of repair from standing empty so long that I suppose the company is willing to submit to a certain loss for the sake of having it inhabited again. But with such a temptingly low rent, how is it that it's not been taken long ago? There have been any number of applications for it." "Indeed, the old fellow in charge of the keys, who showed me over the place yesterday, said no one had inquired about it for 4 years. A peculiar expression passed over the agent's face, but it was not one of surprise. "He said so, did he? I've had plenty of inquiries." "He certainly said so. He was a talkative old man and anxious to impress us with the idea that Sir Eland Shaw left Harbleton Hall suddenly, some considerable time before his lease was up, in consequence of an absurd notion that the house was haunted. Now, personally, I care nothing about it, but my wife is sometimes nervous, and I thought I'd ask you if you know anything of any unusual circumstances connected with his leaving so abruptly." "Judd is a chattering old fool. Did he tell you anything definite about it himself?" asked the agent. Nothing whatever, but he said some nonsense about ghosts driving them away from the place. Of course, there was an absurd story that got about at the time. It was some hocus pocus with a magic lantern, I believe, got up by the young fellows to frighten the servants, with pictures of a skeleton on a sheet hung up somewhere or other. The whole thing was a stupid practical joke, only too successful, for the scare spread to the ladies of the house. And of course Sir Elin had to leave. They made the place too hot for him. And the agent laughed uproariously. I remember all about it now you come to ask me. The young Shaws got up the panic for their own purposes. They found the country too slow for them. They wanted to live in London, so with the simple apparatus of a magic lantern and a sheet or blind, they frightened the family back into town and got what they wanted. Naturally, Sir Elin used not to speak of it when he found it out, for no one is proud of having been made a fool of. And now, my dear sir, he said, assuming an air of great candor, you know as much about this childish folly as I do myself. It has been magnified into something wonderful till we've had that tempting property on our hands all these years in consequence. Mr. Stackpole was pleased and amused with the agent's frank explanation of the basis of Mr. Judd's mysterious illusions, and he and his wife laughed at it together over their evening dinner. Mrs. Stackpole was now willing that her husband should take Harbleton Hall, which he did as a yearly tenant, with the right of taking the property on a lease, if at the end of 3 years he felt inclined to prolong his stay. Then began all the delightful bustle that Mr. Stackpole's soul loved, the drying, warming, painting, lighting, decorating, and furnishing of the old house. The taming and reclaiming of the garden, the stubbing up of old lawns and laying down of new turf, the cleaning and regraveling of weed-grown paths. Such an army of workmen was engaged that Mr. Stackpole calculated that in less than 5 months the house would be ready to go into, and the gardens be all clean, smooth, and bare in their winter tidiness. It must be finished by the middle of December, he said, that I may keep Christmas here with my family, and if every man has done his work well and is out of the house by the 12th of December, I will give each one a bonus on his wages and a Christmas supper to you all. No wonder that the workmen caught something of Mr. Stackpole's enthusiasm, and that every time he brought his wife to see what was going on, she was delighted with the progress made. All their friends were informed of the lucky find of the beautiful old house in Surrey, and invitations were issued long before for a series of entertainments, dances, and private theatricals that they intended to give at Harbleton, in the following January, when their daughter, Mrs. Beaumont, and her husband would be staying with them. Shortly before Mr. and Mrs. Stackpole removed to Harbleton Hall, they were dining out one evening, and after the ladies had left the room and their gentlemen had rearranged their chairs comfortably and were seated at their wine, Mr. Stackpole began on his favorite theme, the furnishing and repairing of the old house in Surrey. As most of those present had frequently heard him on the subject before, he was not much heated and posed on without interruption till a tall, bald-headed gentleman opposite him caught the words Harbleton Hall and became an attentive listener. "Harbleton Hall, did you say? Do you mean the old gabled red brick house 3 miles from Mendleton in Surrey? I hope no friend of yours is thinking of taking it." Mr. Stackpole smiled. "Not exactly a friend of mine, though Probably I know him better than anyone else. I have taken Harbleton Hall myself and intend moving into it next December. The deuce you do, said the bald-headed gentleman, setting down his glass. I don't know why it should surprise you, said Mr. Stackpole. Surprise me? Certainly not, only I thought that the house was empty and likely to remain so. And I'll stop there. I read a lot. Over 35 minutes. Yay! I hope I can get the rest of it finished tomorrow. We'll see, won't we? Trying to mark this. Anyway, I'll let y'all go. Be sweet, don't be ugly. See you tomorrow. 5 bells. Be sweet, don't be ugly. Did I say that? Bye.